The road didn't have a name. Most roads out that far didn't. It was just a dirt track that cut through the high grassland southwest of Caldwell Flats. The kind of path that existed more out of habit than any deliberate planning, worn into the earth by years of cattle drives and supply wagons, and men who needed to get somewhere without being seen doing it. By late October, it was usually empty by mid-afternoon. The light went fast out there once the sun started dropping behind the ridge, and any man with sense was already back at his fire by the time the temperature fell. Rowan Mercer had sense. He also had 40 head of cattle that had scattered into the coulees 2 days ago when a lightning storm spooked them, and he'd spent the better part of those 2 days tracking them back one by one across ground that didn't want to give them up. He was tired in a way that sat behind his eyes and in the joints of his hands. His horse, a gray gelding named Cutter, was tired too. The animal moved with the flat, mechanical rhythm of something that had stopped enjoying the work several hours ago. They were heading home. That was the only thought Rowan had room for. He almost didn't see her. She was off the road by maybe 8 feet, half hidden in a depression where the grass grew long and brown. If Cutter hadn't shied slightly to the left, some smell probably, something the horse registered before Rowan did, he would have ridden past without looking twice. He'd have taken her for a pile of discarded cloth, or a deer carcass, or any of the other unremarkable things that ended up dead beside frontier roads. But Cutter shied, and Rowan looked, and he pulled the gelding to a stop. He sat in the saddle for a moment without moving, long enough to be sure his eyes weren't playing tricks on him in the fading light. They weren't. He swung down from the horse and walked toward her through the grass. She was a woman. That much was clear even before he got close. She was lying face down in the dirt, one arm stretched out in front of her like she'd been reaching for something when she fell, the other tucked beneath her body at an angle that looked wrong. She was large-framed, what his mother's generation would have called a full-figured woman, which meant nothing except that she took up more space in the world than some people were comfortable with, and her dress, which had probably once been a dark green wool, was torn at the sleeve and at the hem and stained through with dirt and something darker than dirt. Her hair, a heavy brown mass, had come loose from whatever arrangement it had been in and was spread across her face and the ground around her head. Rowan crouched down beside her and put 2 fingers to her throat. A pulse. Weak and unsteady, but there. He carefully moved her hair away from her face. She'd been beaten. There was no more diplomatic way to put it. Her left eye was swollen, nearly shut, the skin around it gone dark and purple. Her lower lip was split. There were marks on her jaw that looked like they'd come from knuckles, and a cut along her cheekbone that had bled freely and then dried. The blood on her dress came from somewhere on her side. When Rowan carefully checked, parting the torn fabric with the practical detachment of a man who'd dressed enough wounds on cattle and horses that the mechanics of injury didn't unsettle him, he found a gash along her ribs that was deep enough to need stitching, but not, as far as he could tell, deep enough to have reached anything vital. As far as he could tell, he wasn't a doctor. He sat back on his heels and looked at her for a long moment. Every reasonable voice in his head said the same thing. You don't know who she is. You don't know who did this to her. You don't know if riding her to your cabin brings whatever trouble she's carrying straight to your door. He knew all of that. He'd spent enough years on the frontier to understand that compassion, deployed carelessly, could get a man killed just as efficiently as a bad draw in a card game. He also knew she would be dead by morning if he left her here. The temperature was already dropping. She was losing blood. And whatever had happened to her hadn't happened here. There were no signs of struggle in the immediate area, no dropped belongings, nothing to suggest this was where the violence had occurred. Someone had moved her here after the fact. Or she'd moved herself, dragging her body as far as it would take her before it stopped cooperating. Either way, she'd been left. All right, he said to no one in particular. His voice sounded rough to his own ears, unused. He'd been alone for 2 days. Getting her onto Cutter was harder than he expected. She wasn't dead weight. She made small sounds at certain points, flinching away from his hands without fully waking. But she was close enough to unconscious that she couldn't help him, and she was a substantial woman, and Rowan was tired. He managed it eventually, maneuvering her across the saddle in front of him, keeping one arm around her to hold her steady. She listed against him. He held on. Cutter, to his credit, stood still for the whole business without complaint. The cabin was 4 miles further along the ridgeline. Rowan had built it himself 6 years ago, which meant it had the particular character of a structure that had been added to and repaired and modified so many times that the original design was mostly a theoretical concept at this point. The front room served as kitchen and general living space. There was a back room he used for storage and occasional sleeping when the weather made it impractical to be anywhere else. The main bedroom, if a room with a rope bed and a wool blanket could claim that title, was where he'd been sleeping since winter started coming on. He got the woman inside and onto the bed, which involved another undignified series of maneuvers and resulted in Rowan's back registering a formal complaint that he elected to ignore. He built up the fire in the front room first, then came back with a lamp and set it on the small table beside the bed. In the light, she looked worse than she had outside, which was usually how these things went. The bruising on her face had deepened into colors that had no business being on human skin. The cut on her side, when he looked at it properly, was going to need at minimum 3 stitches and preferably more. He had a small medical kit, the kind of thing any man living alone far from town eventually assembled out of necessity, with needle and thread and carbolic solution and some rolled cloth for bandaging. He was not skilled with the needle in any way that he would brag about. He did the best he could, working carefully and trying not to jostle her more than necessary. She woke up twice during the stitching. The first time, she came awake all at once, the way people did when they'd been deeply unconscious, and something sharp dragged them back to the surface. She made a sound that was halfway between a gasp and a word, grabbed his wrist with a grip that was surprisingly strong for someone in her condition, and stared up at him with an expression that had no room in it for anything but terror. "You're safe," Rowan said, because it was the only thing he could think to say, and it was true, as far as he could control it. "I'm not going to hurt you. I found you on the road. You needed stitching. I'm trying to help." She stared at him. Her grip on his wrist didn't loosen. "My name is Rowan Mercer," he said. "This is my cabin. You're the only one here." Something shifted in her face. Not trust. He wasn't fool enough to call it that, but a slight easing of the absolute animal panic. Her grip loosened, though she didn't let go entirely. "The needle," he said, holding it up so she could see it, "is what woke you. I've got 2 more stitches to do, and then I'll leave you alone. All right?" She watched him for another moment, breathing hard through her nose. Then she closed her eyes and turned her head away and let go of his wrist, which he took as permission. He finished the stitches. She was awake for both of them, though she didn't make a sound. The second time she surfaced was around midnight, when he was sitting at the table in the front room eating the last of a dried beef he'd had in his saddlebag, not really tasting it. He heard movement from the back room, the particular sound of someone trying very hard not to make noise, and got up. She'd made it to the edge of the bed. She was sitting up, one hand pressed against her bandaged side, looking at the room with the deliberate focus of someone taking inventory of every exit. "There's one door out," Rowan said from the doorway, keeping his voice level. "And a window in this room, but it's small and the latch sticks. I mention it not as a threat, but because if you're thinking about leaving, you should know the temperature outside is somewhere around freezing and you don't have a coat." She looked at him. In the lamplight he could see her eyes clearly for the first time. Dark brown, very direct. The kind of eyes that had gotten used to looking at people carefully before deciding what to say. "Who are you?" she said. Her voice was rough and low, and there was a flatness to it that suggested the question wasn't really a question, more a test of what kind of answer she'd get. "I told you. Rowan Mercer. I run cattle on the land east of here. Found you on the road off the Caldwell track." "Alone?" "It's my land. Usually alone on it, yes." She was quiet for a moment. Still doing the inventory, he thought, cataloging him. "My name," she said finally, "is Mara Vale." "Mara." He nodded once. "Are you hungry?" She looked at him like that was the wrong question. "I have dried beef," he said, "and I can heat up some of the cornmeal I've got. It's not much. Why are you helping me?" Came out flat, not as a question. An accusation almost. The tone of someone who had learned to be suspicious of kindness because of what usually came attached to it. Rowan thought about the various honest answers to that question and chose the simplest one. "Because you were going to die in that grass," he said, "and I didn't want that to happen. You don't know me. No. So why does it matter to you?" He considered that. "It just does," he said. "I don't have a more complicated answer than that." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked down at her hands, which were resting in her lap, and he saw her notice the bandages on her side for the first time, really notice them, not just register their existence. "You stitched it," she said. "Best I could. You should have a real doctor look at it when you're able." "How many?" "5. You've had worse done, I expect, or you'd have made more noise." Something crossed her face at that. Not quite a smile, not quite anything, and she looked away at the window. "I'll take the food," she said, "if it's offered." "Tuts." He heated the cornmeal and brought it to her with a tin cup of water and a piece of the dried beef, and set it on the table beside the bed and stepped back. She ate without self-consciousness, which he respected. Some people got shy about eating in front of strangers. Marvale ate like someone who understood that food was fuel, and right now her body needed it badly, and there was no dignity to be preserved by pretending otherwise. He went back to the front room and gave her privacy. In the morning, she was asleep when he went to check on her, her breathing steadier and her color slightly better than the night before. He did his morning chores quietly, fed the horses, checked the fence line along the near pasture, brought in more wood, and made coffee when he came back in, and left a cup outside the bedroom door. He didn't hear her move for most of the morning. Around midday, when he was at the workbench in the front room repairing a piece of tack that had been needing attention for weeks, the bedroom door opened. She stood in the doorway in her torn dress, her hair back off her face in a rough braid she'd made from what she had available. The bruising on her face had reached that particular stage of purpling that looked worse than the initial injury, which meant it was doing what bruising was supposed to do. She was moving carefully, one hand near her side without quite pressing on it. She was, he noticed, a tall woman. He was not a short man, and she nearly matched him in height. There was a solidity to her that had nothing to do with the fullness of her frame. Something in the way she stood, even hurt, that suggested she was not accustomed to taking up less space than she needed. "The coffee's on the stove," he said, turning back to the tack. "Cup on the shelf." He heard her pour herself a cup, heard her settle, with what sounded like some care, into the chair by the window. "How long was I out?" she said. "Found you yesterday evening. You woke up twice in the night. It's midday now." "I need to know if anyone's been by." "No one's been by." "If they come, I'll handle it," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "You don't know who they are?" "Not yet." He kept his attention on the leather in his hands, not looking at her. He could feel her watching him with that same careful assessment from the night before. "You're not afraid," she said. It wasn't an admiring observation, more like she was trying to categorize him, figure out what kind of man he was, whether the fearlessness came from competence or from stupidity. "I've got enough to be cautious about," he said. "Whether to be afraid is a different question." She drank her coffee in silence for a while. "I can't pay you," she said eventually. "If that's what you're waiting for." He looked up at that. "I'm not waiting for anything," he said. "You can stay until you're well enough to go where you're going. There's no bill." She looked at him steadily, trying to find the catch. He could see her looking for it. "All right," she said at last. The word came out careful, like she was setting it down gently in case it broke. The days that followed had a careful quality to them. Mara healed the way people healed when they'd taken serious damage. Not in a straight line, not reliably. Some days she was up and moving around the front room, eating well and sitting by the window for long hours watching the ridge line. Some days she stayed in bed and he left her food and water outside the door and didn't push. The bruising shifted through its spectrum of colors. The swelling in her eye reduced slowly. The stitches in her side held. She didn't offer much conversation. Neither did he. They'd found a way to occupy the same space without crowding each other, which wasn't nothing. Plenty of people couldn't manage it. What she did do, once she was well enough to be up for most of the day, was make herself useful. He came in from the pasture on the 4th day to find the front room swept and a pot of something on the stove that smelled considerably better than anything he'd put together in recent memory. She was at the workbench where he kept his tools, sharpening a knife with the methodical focus of someone who'd done it many times. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know," she said, and kept sharpening. He ate what she'd cooked, a rabbit stew, thicker than he made it, seasoned with dried herbs from the jar he kept on the shelf and hadn't touched in 2 years. And he ate it without comment, which he thought was the appropriate response. "It's good." he said finally, because withholding a true thing seemed worse than saying it. She was eating across the table from him. It's adequate, she said. You don't have enough of anything. Town's a day's ride. I know what town's a day's ride. He looked at her. You've been through Caldwell Flats before. Not a question, the way she'd said it. She'd answered before she'd decided whether to answer. Once, she said, her eyes dropping back to her bowl. He didn't push. On the 6th day, it rained. Not the light autumn drizzle that had been threatening all week, but a real rain. The kind that came in sideways off the ridge and made the windows rattle and the firework hard to stay relevant. By evening, it had escalated into something that qualified as a proper storm. Thunder rolling in off the mountains, lightning throwing brief white light through the gaps in the shutters. Rowan was at the table with a lamp and a ledger book, working through the numbers on the cattle he'd recovered, marking which animals he was still short and calculating whether it was worth a second look or whether he'd already found what there was to find. Mara was in the chair by the window, which was a choice given that there was no view through it tonight, watching the lightning come and go. At some point, the silence changed. It didn't get louder or quieter, it just got different. He noticed it the way you noticed a shift in the wind, not by looking at anything in particular, but by some ambient change in the quality of the room. He looked up. She was still in the chair, but she was no longer watching the window. She was watching her own hands, which were folded in her lap, and she had the expression of someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had finally gotten tired of pretending they weren't. He put the pen down and closed the ledger. He didn't say anything. He'd found over the years that saying nothing was underrated. People filled silence according to what they needed, not according to what you offered them, and what you offered them was usually wrong. She was quiet for a long time, long enough that he thought maybe he'd misread it. Maybe she was just tired. Then she said, "They'll come looking for me." He waited. "Not because they want me back," she said. The flatness was back in her voice, but different now, like something that had been pressed flat by weight rather than cut flat by habit. "Because they want to be sure I'm dead." He kept his eyes on her without speaking. "There are 4 of them that matter," she said. "The one who runs things is a man named Harlow, Crail Harlow. I don't know if you've heard the name out this way, but in the territory south of the Platte, people know him. People know him the way they know bad weather. You try to be somewhere else when it's coming." "What's his business?" Rowan said. "Moving people?" She said it flat and direct, like she'd decided precision mattered more than softness. Moving people who don't want to be moved, keeping them somewhere they don't want to be, and charging other men for access. Women, mostly. Some men. Whoever comes along that looks like they won't be missed. He held himself very still. "I wasn't taken," she said, before he could ask. I made a bad decision. A man I thought I could trust told me there was work, respectable work. In a town 2 territories over, I needed the work. She stopped, started again. "It doesn't matter how it happened. What matters is I was there for 8 months, and for 8 months I tried to be quiet and manageable and look for a way out that didn't get me killed. And then I found one, and I ran." "How far did you get?" "Further than I expected." Something shifted in her face that might have been grim satisfaction. "I stole one of their horses and I rode for 3 days. When the horse gave out, I walked. I was trying to reach the Caldwell Road because I thought there'd be traffic, and I could find... I thought someone would..." She stopped again. "I didn't make it as far as I thought. Harlow's men caught up to me on the 2nd day of walking. 2 of them. They took back what I'd stolen, and they..." She looked at her hands again. "And they left me where you found me." "They beat you and left you to die," Rowan said. "They laughed about it," she said, "while they were doing it. One of them said, he said nobody was going to come looking for a woman like me." A pause. "He meant my size. People like him, they think a woman my size is..." She took a breath. "They think it's funny. They think it means I matter less." Rowan was quiet for a moment. The storm moved overhead, something banging against the side of the cabin. "He was wrong," Rowan said. She looked at him. He could see her deciding whether to believe it, not because she doubted his sincerity, he thought, but because she'd had the opposite said to her often enough that the opposite had gotten comfortable. "Maybe," she said, Not maybe. He said it without heat, the way he'd say the sky was gray, just a fact. He was wrong. She looked at him for another moment, then looked away, out the dark window. Harlow has riders all over this part of the territory, she said. He does business with people in town, people with money and standing. I don't know who. That's the problem. I don't know who to trust and who not to. That's why I can't just walk into Caldwell Flats and go to the law. The law in Caldwell Flats is a man named Del Pruitt, Rowan said. He's lazy and he drinks too much and he wouldn't know how to stand up to a man like Harlow, even if the thought occurred to him. You're right not to count on him. She nodded slowly. But that doesn't mean there's nothing to be done, he said. She looked at him again. Don't make promises. I'm not. He leaned back in his chair. I'm just saying I've been in this territory for 12 years. I know people. I know who owes what to who, and I know where the bones are buried, metaphorically speaking. That's not nothing. Against Harlow. Against anybody. Men like that survive because they pick their ground carefully. They pick people who are alone and afraid, and who don't have anyone standing behind them. He held her gaze. You're not alone. The storm cracked overhead, and for a moment the room was very bright, and then very dark, and then just the lamp again, steady and small. Maravale looked at him across the table with something in her face that he couldn't entirely read. Not trust, not yet, not quite, but maybe the first tentative thing that could become trust if it was handled with enough care. I don't know why you're doing this, she said. I know. That doesn't bother you? That I don't know? Not particularly. He reached for the ledger again, not to work, but to give his hand something to do that wasn't directed at her. You'll figure it out eventually, or you won't. Either way, the situation is what it is. She looked at her hands again. Outside, the rain hammered the roof. He has 4 men with him, usually, she said. That's the count I knew when I left. Harlow himself and 4 riders. One of them, a man called Dex. He's the one who... She touched her jaw briefly, involuntarily. He's the one who found me particularly amusing. Rowan noted the name and said nothing. They move around, she said. But there's a place south of here, near a creek crossing called Bitterwater. There's an old way station there. Harlow uses it between jobs. I heard them mention it. I don't know if they're there now, but it's a place to start, he said. She looked at him sharply. I said, don't make promises. I'm not making promises, he said. I'm gathering information. She studied him for a long moment. Then she said, all right, in that same careful voice she'd used on the first night, setting the word down gently, and turned back to the window. He opened the ledger again and did not work, just sat with the sound of the storm and the lamp burning between them, and thought about a man named Crail Harlow and a creek crossing called Bitterwater and what could be done about the distance between where they were now and where things needed to get to. It was a long night. The storm ran its course somewhere around 3 in the morning, and when it was done, the silence it left behind had a different quality than the silence before. Cleaner, maybe, or just emptied out in a way that made the remaining things stand out more clearly. Mara had fallen asleep in the chair. She hadn't meant to. Her head had tipped sideways against the window frame, one hand still in her lap, her breathing gone slow and regular. He got the wool blanket from the storage room and put it over her without waking her, and then he sat back down and looked at the ledger numbers he hadn't actually been reading and thought for a long time about what it meant to have a fight, come to your door versus what it meant to go and meet it yourself. The cattle tallied short by 7 head, which was annoying but not catastrophic. Everything else was a more complicated calculation. He blew out the lamp around 4 and went to bed, and lay in the dark listening to nothing, and eventually slept. The morning after the storm, the world outside the cabin looked like it had been wrung out and hung up to dry. The grass lay flat in patches where the rain had beaten it down. The track leading away from the cabin toward the ridge had turned to soft mud, and the creek that ran along the eastern fence line was running high and brown and loud enough to hear from the porch. Rowan stood in the doorway with his coffee and looked at all of it and calculated, as he did every morning, what the day was going to require of him. The answer was more than he felt like giving. He'd slept badly. Not because of the storm, which had stopped bothering him as a sleeping obstacle sometime in his 30s, but because the conversation with Mara had settled into the back of his mind and stayed there, turning itself over in the slow way that serious things did when they found a purchase. He'd lain awake for a long time thinking about Crail Harlow and what a man like that looked like, what shape he occupied in the territory, how much of the local structure had quietly arranged itself around him, the way creek water arranged itself around a rock. Harlow wasn't a name Rowan had heard. That was notable in itself. He'd been in this territory for 12 years, and he knew most of the names that mattered, at least the names that operated openly. A man who ran that kind of business, the moving of people against their will, the selling of access, was a man who stayed out of ordinary conversation, who kept his profile low and his connections quiet, and made sure the men who knew about him had reason to stay quiet too. That kind of man was more dangerous than the kind who made noise. Noise was manageable. Silence was the thing that got you. He heard movement inside. Mara, up and moving. He stepped off the porch to let her have the front room without him standing in the doorway watching, and went to check on the horses. Cutter had come through the storm without incident. The second horse, a bay mare named Plenty that he'd owned for 3 years and trusted considerably more than most people, was standing at the fence with the expression of a horse that had opinions about the weather and was choosing not to share them. He checked their feet and gave them both grain and talked to them in the way he'd gotten used to talking to animals that weren't going to talk back. Not affectionately, exactly, but practically. The way you'd brief a colleague on the status of things. "We've got a situation," he told Plenty, who flicked one ear and stamped. "Nothing you need to worry about, probably." When he came back inside, Mara had the stove going and was making cornmeal. She'd smoothed out her dress as best it could be smoothed and rebraided her hair, and she was moving with more ease than she had the day before. Still careful around her left side, still holding herself slightly off-center, but less like someone expecting the ground to tilt under her. "You slept in the chair," he said. "I know where I slept. The bed's there. I know where the bed is." She didn't look at him. "I wasn't trying to take your bed. It's not being used when I'm not in it." She turned the cornmeal without responding, which he took to mean the conversation was over. He poured himself more coffee and sat down. They ate without talking for a while, which had become their version of normal. He'd noticed that Mara used silence the way some people used words, deliberately, as a tool, not just as the absence of something. When she was quiet, it usually meant she was thinking, and what she was thinking about was usually something she wasn't ready to say yet. This morning, the silence had a different quality to it, more restless. He could see it in the way she held her spoon. "Tell me about bitter water," he said. She looked up. "The way station you mentioned, what do you know about it?" She set her spoon down. "I told you what I know. You told me it exists. I'm asking about the physical situation, how far from the road, what the structure looks like, how many men Harlow typically keeps there." She studied him for a moment. "You're actually going. I'm thinking about it. That's not what thinking looks like. That's what planning looks like." He shrugged. "Rowan." She said his name with a specific weight, like she was using it as a handle. "These men put me in the ground, or tried to. They will not hesitate to do the same to you, and you have less reason for it to happen." Less reason meaning they don't know you, yet. She picked up her spoon again, turned it over in her fingers without using it. "That changes the moment you ride toward bitter water. You go down there, they see you, and now you're not a stranger. Now you're a problem." "I've been a problem before. Not like this." He looked at her steadily. "Tell me about the way station." She held his gaze for a long moment, and he could see her doing the same calculation she'd been doing since the first night, trying to assess what kind of man he was, whether what she told him would be used well or used wrong or lost entirely because he walked into something he didn't understand. Then she told him. The Bitter Waterway station had been a legitimate operation once, a relay stop on the old freight route that had mostly been replaced by better roads further north. The building itself was solid, she said, built from timber and sod with a proper roof, not the kind of thrown-together structure that fell apart in heavy weather. There was a main room and two smaller ones at the back, a barn that could hold 6 or 8 horses. The creek, the Bitter Water Creek, which had given the place its name because of the mineral taste the water picked up from the rock formations upstream, ran along the south side of the property and provided cover on that approach. Harlow used it as a base between operations. She'd been there twice during the 8 months she'd spent under his control. Once when she'd first arrived and everything was still confusion and fear, and once about 3 months in when they'd moved the group she was with for reasons she'd never been told. She'd had time during the second stay to look at the layout more carefully, because by then she'd understood that she needed to know these things. The men he keeps there, she said, it's usually 2, sometimes 3, the ones who aren't moving with him. There's always someone on watch at night, but it's not consistent. They get lazy about it, especially when there's been a job completed. They think the isolation protects them. Nobody comes to Bitterwater on accident. How far south? Half-day's ride from here, maybe a bit more. There's a fork off the Caldwell Road about 2 hours out. You take the left branch down toward the creek drainage. The road gets rough after that. You'll smell the mineral water before you see the buildings. He committed all of it and said nothing for a moment. I'm not asking you to ride down there and start something, she said. I'm telling you what I know because you asked and because… She stopped. Because what? She was quiet for a moment. Because it's the first time in a long time that someone's asked, she said, in a tone that didn't want sympathy attached to it, just acknowledgement. What I know, what I saw, like it matters. He didn't say anything to that. He just nodded once, which felt like the right response, not making more of it than she'd offered, but not letting it disappear either. 3 days later, without telling Mara what he was doing, Rowan rode south. He told her he was going to check the south pasture, which was true as far as it went. There was a section of fence down there that needed attention, and he'd been putting it off. He took his tools. He also took his rifle, which he always did when he rode the South Range, and his good knife, which he always did when he went anywhere, and a particular kind of attention that he didn't usually need for fence repair. He didn't go to Bitterwater. He wasn't ready to go to Bitterwater. What he did was ride close enough to the fork Mara had described to identify it, and then he took a different track that ran parallel to the creek drainage from higher ground, where the scrub oak was thick enough to provide cover, and he sat for a while and watched. He didn't see the way station from there, but he saw smoke, about 2 miles south and east, the thin gray thread of it rising against the sky in the way that a banked fire produced. Not cooking smoke, not a fire built up against cold, just the quiet evidence of something burning low and steady. The kind of fire that meant habitation. Someone at home, comfortable, not expecting company. He watched it for a long time. Then he rode home. Mara was in the front room when he got back, sitting at the table with a piece of paper and a stub of pencil, working on something she turned face down when he came through the door. He noted that and didn't mention it. Fence? She said. Needed more work than I thought. He hung up his coat. I'll go back tomorrow. She looked at him for a moment with an expression that said she didn't entirely believe him, but she didn't push it, and he went to deal with the horses and thought about thin smoke against a gray sky and what it told you about the men who made it. The trouble started 9 days after he'd found her. He was at the workbench when he heard Cutter kick the side of his stall twice in quick succession, the horse's particular signal for strangers approaching, which Rowan had come to rely on as reliably as a watch. He went to the window first, moving away from the light, and looked out toward the approach track. 2 riders, coming at an easy pace, nothing threatening in their posture, the way men moved when they wanted to appear harmless. One of them was heavy-set, riding a dun horse. The other was younger, thinner, riding a dark roan. He didn't recognize either of them. He went to the bedroom door and knocked twice, quickly. Company, he said. 2 men. Stay back here and stay quiet. A pause. Then, what do they look like? He described them quickly. Another pause, longer. The one on the dun, Mara said, and her voice had changed, gone flat in a specific way, like a shutter closing. Is his coat brown? Like a dirty canvas color? He looked out the window again. Yes. A long silence. That's Greer, she said. He rides for Harlow. He processed that. The other one? I don't know. I don't recognize him from what you said. He looked out again. The 2 men had stopped at the edge of the track, maybe 200 yards from the cabin, and one of them was standing up in his stirrups looking at the property, taking stock. Don't come out regardless of what you hear, Rowan said. Unless it goes bad. You'll know if it goes bad. Rowan, I mean it. Stay back. He didn't wait for her answer. He took his rifle from the pegs above the door, checked the load, and leaned it against the wall beside the front door where it was accessible but not visible from outside. Then he stepped out onto the porch and stood there with his hands loose at his sides and waited for them to come to him. They came at the same easy pace. When they got to about 50 feet, they stopped, and the heavy-set one, Greer, Mara had called him, and Rowan filed that away, touched the brim of his hat in the gesture that passed for politeness on the frontier. "Afternoon," Greer said. "This Mercer land?" "It is," Rowan said. "We're looking for a woman." Greer's voice was conversational, unhurried, the voice of a man who had done this kind of thing many times and found it unremarkable. "Traveling alone, big woman, brown hair, would have been in bad shape, hurt, maybe." "Haven't seen anyone fitting that description," Rowan said. "She might have come through this way. We're riding the whole track." "Like I said." Greer looked at him. The younger rider had said nothing, but his eyes had been moving the whole time. Across the cabin, the barn, the fence line, the outbuildings. The eyes of someone counting exits and obstacles. Rowan tracked this with the part of his mind that stayed separate from conversation. "Somebody found a horse about 8 miles north of here," Greer said. "Good horse. Left out in a storm, which wasn't kind. Horse belonged to a man we work with. We're trying to return it and find out what happened to the woman who had it." "Horse is your business," Rowan said. "Woman sounds like she went her own way." "Well, that's the thing." Greer shifted in the saddle, easy, casual. "She wasn't in a condition to go far. We're worried about her." Everything in the man's posture said the opposite of worried, but Rowan kept his face flat. "I'll keep an eye out," he said. Greer looked at him for a moment, the kind of look that was a calculation dressed up as pleasantness. "You run this place alone?" "I do." "Long way out for one man." "I prefer it." A small pause. "We might have work, if you're interested. Man we ride for is always looking for reliable help." "I've got my own work," Rowan said. Greer nodded slowly. Then he looked at the cabin again. One long look, the kind that was meant to be seen, and then back at Rowan. "Well, we appreciate your time." He touched his hat again. "You think of anything about that woman, there's a camp south of here. Bitter Water Crossing. Ask for Mr. Harlow, he'll see you right." "I'll remember that," Rowan said. He watched them ride back out the way they came. He stayed on the porch until they were well off the property, and the sound of their horses had faded, and then he stayed a while longer to see if they'd circle back. They didn't, or they were good enough at it that he couldn't tell. He went inside. Mara was in the doorway of the bedroom. She'd moved the small table that had been against the wall and positioned it between herself and the outer door, which wasn't much as a barricade but showed the right instincts. "They're gone," he said. She said nothing. She was looking at him with that shutter-closed expression, and her hands were gripping the doorframe. "Greer," Rowan said. "That's the name. He mentioned Harlow and Bitterwater both, which he wouldn't have done if they were trying to be subtle. He wanted me to know who he was writing for." "A warning," she said. "A warning. Or a test to see how I'd react." He took his coat off and hung it up. "Did Harlow know you were heading this direction? Was there any reason he'd look this far north?" "He knows I was on the Caldwell Road." Her voice was careful, controlled. "That narrows it." And Greer found the horse. "He found the horse 8 miles north, which tells him you got that far at least." He thought about it. "He's sweeping the road, checking every property. It's a patient approach." "Harlow is patient. Good to know." He sat down at the table. "What do you know about Greer?" She came fully out of the doorway and sat across from him, not at the table, but in the chair, keeping some distance between herself and the conversation, like she could manage its weight better from there. "He's been with Harlow a long time, since before I was there. He's not smart, but he's thorough. He notices things. He'll have looked at this place and counted the horses, and noticed the extra coffee cup on the shelf and the woman's shawl on the peg." Rowan turned and looked at the peg by the door. The shawl he'd found in his storage room. It had belonged to his sister, left there on her one visit 4 years ago, was hanging where Mara had put it 2 days ago without either of them discussing it. He'd stopped noticing it was there. "He'll have noted it," he said. "He'll go back and tell Harlow there's a lone man on an isolated property with evidence of a woman present, and that the man was calm and unfriendly and claimed not to have seen her." How does Harlow read calm and unfriendly? She considered. Depends. He's smart enough to know that scared men usually try to be too friendly, too helpful, to deflect suspicion. A man who's flat and sends you on your way isn't necessarily hiding something. That's just how some men are out here. She paused. But the shawl, that'll stick with Greer. He'll mention it. How long before they come back? A day, maybe 2. Harlow won't come himself, not yet. He'll send more men. Rowan was quiet for a moment. Outside, a wind was picking up, moving through the grass with that autumn sound that always seemed to him slightly mournful, though he'd never said that out loud to anyone. I need to send a message, he said. She looked at him. To who? A man named Frank Aldis. He's a deputy federal marshal based out of Cheyenne. I've known him for years. We came up through the same territory together, back before he took the commission. He's honest, which is rarer than it sounds. Mara was quiet for a moment. A marshal. A federal one, not Del Pruitt. He held her gaze. What Harlow is doing is a federal offense. Multiple federal offenses. That means Pruitt has no jurisdiction over it, even if he wanted to act, which he doesn't, but Aldis does. A letter takes days. I know. Harlow's men will be back before Aki's. I know, he said again. Sending the letter doesn't solve the immediate problem. It solves the longer one. The immediate problem we solve differently. She looked at him with that expression again, the one that was trying to locate him, to figure out what category of man this was that she was sitting across the table from. What does differently look like? She said. It looks like you staying somewhere less obvious while I do some things that are better done without you in the cabin when Harlow's men come back. She straightened very slightly. I'm not running. I'm not asking you to run. I'm asking you to use your head. If Greer comes back with 4 men and you're here, there's only one conversation that leads to. If you're not here, there's a different set of options. And where exactly do you think I'd go? She said, and there was an edge to it now. Not anger, but something that had been compressed for a long time and was finding a small exit. I have no money. I have no horse. I have no coat that fits. The nearest town is a day's ride, and I have reason to think some of the people in it are connected to Harlow. Where would you like me to go? He'd already thought about this. There's a woman named Bess Caulfield about 6 miles west, he said. She runs a sheep operation with her husband, who's currently in poor health and not likely to be any use to anyone, but Bess herself is a formidable person. I've helped her with fencing twice this year, and she helped me during a bad winter 2 years back. She doesn't owe me anything, and I don't owe her. But we trust each other in the way that neighbors trust each other when trust is a practical necessity. He watched Mara take this in. She has a room, he continued. I'd send you with a note explaining the situation. She's not the kind of woman who asks too many questions or gets frightened easily. And she is 6 miles west, which is far enough from this cabin that if Harlow's men come here looking, they're not looking there. You'd tell her the truth. Enough of it. She doesn't need all of it. She needs to know you're in danger and that the danger shouldn't follow you to her property. And she needs to know I'm asking for the favor. Mara looked at her hands. The gesture was becoming familiar to him. When she needed to think without looking at anyone, she looked at her hands as if she kept something useful there. How do you know she'll say yes? She said. I don't, he said, but I think she will. A long quiet. And what are you doing here? She said. While I'm at this woman's house. Writing to Frank Aldis, and then making the situation here complicated enough that Harlow's men have reason to think twice. That's not a real answer. It's the best one I've got right now. She looked at him. He looked back. He'd come to understand over the past week how their arguments resolved, not with one of them convincing the other exactly, but with both of them arriving at the edge of what they could plan for and acknowledging that the rest was going to have to work itself out. All right, she said. For the 3rd time since they'd met, that careful word set down gently. He wrote the letter to Frank Aldis that evening at the table by the lamp in the practical and unlovely handwriting of a man who used writing as a tool rather than a craft. He put in the name Crail Harlow and the location at Bitterwater and what Mara had told him about the nature of the operation, keeping the details factual and the language plain. Frank Aldis was a practical man who dealt in evidence, not in elaboration. He sealed the letter and set it aside to go with the supply rider who came through from Caldwell Flats every 2 weeks. That was 12 days away, which was longer than ideal, but there was a man at the general store in town who handled correspondence, and Rowan had occasionally used him before. There was also the possibility of riding to town himself, but he wasn't ready to leave the property unattended. Mara was in the bedroom when he finished writing, but she wasn't sleeping. He could tell by the quality of silence from behind the closed door. He thought about knocking, decided against it. She had enough to think about without him adding to it by asking how she was, which was a question that had no good answer right now, and probably both of them knew it. He banked the fire and went to bed. In the morning, he was up before dawn, as he always was, and he saddled Plenty and led her around to the front of the cabin and tied her loosely where she'd be ready, and he went inside and made coffee and was sitting with it when Mara came out of the bedroom. She had, he saw, gathered her few things. He'd found her a coat 2 days earlier, one of his own, too large but warm, and she had it over her arm, and the small cloth she'd been using as a bag had something in it that gave it weight. "You're going early," he said. "Better than going when someone might see me on the road." That was true. He nodded. He'd written a second note, this one to Bess Caulfield, and he gave it to Mara along with directions to the Caulfield property. Specific enough to be useful, covering the landmarks she'd need to watch for in the low morning light. She took the note and looked at the directions and didn't say anything for a moment. "What do I tell her?" Mara said, "when she asks what happened?" "Tell her the truth," he said, "or as much of it as feels right. Bess isn't someone who needs things softened for her." She folded the note and put it in the cloth bag. "Rowan." She said it the same way she had 2 days ago, with that particular weight. "Don't do something that gets you killed." "I'll try not to," he said, which was the only honest answer. She looked at him. Something moved in her face that he didn't try to name. "The stitches are holding," she said, which was not what she'd meant to say, he thought, but was what came out. "In case you were wondering." "Good," he said. She went out to Plenty and untied her and got up, which she did with the slight difficulty of someone whose left side was still reminding her of what had happened, and she settled into the saddle and looked back at him once from the track. He raised one hand. She turned the horse west and rode. He stood on the porch for a while after she was gone, until the gray light strengthened enough that he could see the ridge clearly, and the sky had made its decision about what kind of day it was going to be. It was going to be cold. Clear. The kind of day when you could see a long way in every direction, which was both an advantage and a liability, depending on where you were standing. He went inside, drank the rest of his coffee, and started thinking seriously about what Harlow's men would find when they came back, and how to make sure it was something that worked for him, not for them. Bess Caulfield was not what Mara had expected. She'd built a picture of the woman from Rowan's description, formidable, practical, not easily frightened, and had prepared herself accordingly, rehearsing in her head how she would explain herself, what parts of the truth to lead with, and what parts to hold back until trust had been established. She'd done this kind of calculation before, the math of how much honesty a stranger could absorb without it going wrong, and she was reasonably good at it by now. What she hadn't prepared for was a woman of about 60, who came to the door of a well-kept timber house with flour on her hands and a look on her face that said she'd seen enough of the world's varieties of trouble that another version of it showing up on her porch before breakfast was not going to rattle her significantly. Bess Caulfield read Rowan's note. She looked at Mara. She looked at the coat that was too large by 4 inches in the sleeve and the bruising still visible along Mara's jaw, and the way Mara was holding herself slightly off-center from the residual pull of the stitched wound. "Come in," she said, and turned back into the house. That was all. No interrogation on the porch, no conditions stated in advance, no weighing of the inconvenience against the obligation. Just come in, as if it were obvious. Mara stood in the doorway for a moment before following her. The inside of the Caulfield house was the kind of interior that accumulated over decades rather than being arranged. Shelves built at different heights because they'd been added as needed. A table that had been repaired so many times the original wood was mostly theoretical. A rag rug in front of the stove that was at least 3 rugs layered together over years. It smelled like bread and lanolin and wood smoke and something herbal she couldn't identify. A thin man was visible through a doorway at the back. Bess's husband, presumably, in poor health, as Rowan had said. He didn't look up. Bess put coffee in front of her without asking and sat down across the table. "The note says you're in a spot," she said, "and that Rowan Mercer's involved." "He helped me," Mara said. There were men. I had to leave. The bruising's a week old, maybe a bit more. Bess said, not unkindly. Whoever put it there did a thorough job. Mara said nothing. You don't have to tell me the whole of it, Bess said. Rowan's note says the men looking for you shouldn't be told you're here, and that's enough for me to go on. I've known that man 6 years, and he doesn't ask for things without reason. She looked at Mara steadily. What I need to know is whether this situation is likely to come to my door with guns. Mara considered the honest answer to that question. It's possible, she said, but they don't know I came this direction. They're searching north and east along the Caldwell Road. I think this is far enough removed that they won't think to look here, but I can't promise you it's no risk. Bess nodded once, as if Mara had confirmed something she'd already decided. The room at the back is empty, she said. Has been since our youngest left. I ask that you don't go into town or ride the main roads while you're here. I'll need help with the sheep if you're up to it. My husband can't do it right now, and I've been managing alone. I can help, Mara said immediately. Not today. Today you eat and sleep. Bess stood. The bread's almost done. You look like you could use the whole loaf. There was no weight to the observation, no commentary embedded in it, no humor at Mara's expense. Just the plain and practical truth that a woman who had ridden 6 miles in the early cold after a week of recovery needed food. Mara sat at the table in Bess Caulfield's kitchen and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, something she didn't have a clean word for. Not safe exactly, because she knew better than to call anything safe right now, but steadied, maybe, like a boat that had been listing and found a calmer stretch of water. It was not nothing. Back at the Mercer cabin, Rowan was building the kind of morning that looked ordinary from the outside and was not. He'd moved the shawl from the peg by the door first thing. Then he'd collected the few other signs of Mara's presence. The extra cup she'd left on the shelf, the cloth she'd used to bind her hair before he'd found her a proper tie, the particular way she'd arranged the dried herbs on the cooking shelf, alphabetical for reasons she hadn't explained, and put them away in the storage room. Not because he was trying to erase her presence exactly, because Greer had noticed the shawl and would notice its absence, and what men like Greer noted and then saw removed told them different things depending on why they thought it had been removed. He wanted Greer to think the woman had moved on, left of her own accord. Either that or was never there. He then spent an hour on the fence line in the south pasture, which genuinely needed it, and let himself be visible while he worked. A man going about his ordinary business, alone on his land, nothing complicated about his situation. If anyone was watching from the ridge, which he couldn't rule out, that was the image they would take away. He was not, in fact, a calm man today. He was a man holding himself very deliberately in the shape of a calm man, which was different. And he was aware of the difference, and he kept the awareness somewhere quiet and separate from the part of him that was doing the visible things. The letter to Frank Aldous was in his coat pocket. He'd revised it twice in the night, adding detail about the Bitter Water location and about Greer's visit, and he'd added a note about the scope of what Harlow appeared to be operating, the number of people he'd moved, the territories involved, the connections to men of standing in the local town structure. Frank was a federal man. Federal men needed scope. They needed the shape of a thing, not just the immediate incident. He couldn't ride to town today. Today, he needed to be here, visible and unremarkable, in case Harlow's people came back. They came in the afternoon. He heard Cutter before he saw them. 2 kicks, pause, 2 more, which meant more than 2 riders, which meant something different than Greer's earlier visit. He was at the water trough when they came up the track, and he straightened and stood where he was and watched them come. 4 men, Greer on his dun horse in the lead, the same younger rider from before alongside him, and 2 he hadn't seen. The 2 new ones had the particular posture of men who were here to impress rather than to ask questions. Sitting up in the saddle, hands loose but deliberate, the kind of posture that was meant to be read as readiness. Rowan wiped his hands on his trousers and waited. "Mercer," Greer said, with the tone of a man who'd decided to skip the pleasantries this time. "We'd like to look around your property." "Would you?" Rowan said. "Your cooperation would be appreciated." "Is that right?" He looked at the 4 of them, taking his time. "What are you looking for exactly?" "Same as before. The woman." "I told you I hadn't seen her." "You did say that." Greer held his gaze, neither aggressive nor retreating, just steady. "Mr. Harlow would like us to be thorough." Mr. Harlow doesn't have any authority over my property, Rowan said, and neither do you. A pause. The younger rider shifted in his saddle. One of the new men, heavy, with a red beard going to gray, put his hand on his thigh, not on the gun, but near it. We're not looking for trouble, Greer said. Good. Then ride on. Mercer, I told you she wasn't here. She's not here. You're welcome to go around the outside of the fence line and look, because there's nothing out there that tells a different story. You're not welcome inside my property line, and you're not welcome in my cabin. He kept his voice level and his hands where they were. If Mr. Harlow has a concern about a missing woman, he should speak to the law. Del Pruitt isn't... I said the law. He said it without inflection. If there's a woman missing who needs finding, the sheriff in Caldwell Flats is the man for that. Not 4 riders on private land. Greer looked at him for a long time. Rowan could see the man doing his reading, looking at Rowan's posture, his hands, the distance to the cabin door, what he could see through the window, what he couldn't. Greer was thorough, Mara had said, and she was right. Rowan could feel him being thorough. The shawl, Greer said finally. On the peg, when I was here before. It's gone. My sister's, Rowan said. I sent it back with the supply rider. Your sister. She visited in August, left some things. The rider came through and I sent it back to her. That a problem? Another long look. Greer believed about half of it, Rowan estimated. Which was enough. A man who believed nothing would have reacted differently. We'll be in the area, Greer said. Not a threat, technically, just information. I'll keep that in mind, Rowan said. He stood at the fence and watched them ride out. He didn't move until they were off the property and well down the track, and then he went inside and sat down at the table and let out a breath he'd been holding, more or less, since they'd appeared on the horizon. That bought time. Not much, but some. He rode to Caldwell Flats the next morning. It was a calculated decision. Staying on the property was the cautious option, but caution had limits, and what he needed now was information and a way to get the letter to Frank Aldis faster than the supply rider's schedule. There was a man in Caldwell Flats named Otto Rice who ran the telegraph office in the back of his dry goods store, and a telegraph was considerably faster than a letter and considerably harder to intercept on the road. He also wanted to take the measure of the town. Mara had said Harlow had connections there, people with money and standing who did business with him. He didn't know who, but he'd been in Caldwell Flats enough times over 12 years to have a sense of how it worked, who talked to who, where the alignments were. And sometimes you only saw those things clearly when you looked at them from inside with a specific question to answer. The ride was 2 hours on the main road, and he took it at a steady pace, watching the country on either side without appearing to. He didn't see Harlow's riders, but that didn't mean they weren't there. Caldwell Flats was a town that had been built with optimism and maintained with stubbornness. The main street ran 4 blocks, with a general store, a hotel that was also a saloon, a livery, a doctor's office, and the small building that served simultaneously as Del Pruitt's office and the town's official law enforcement presence. There was a church he had no particular business with. There were smaller streets running off the main one with houses and a school and a barber and a woman who sold eggs and occasionally information depending on what you needed. He tied up at the general store and went inside. Otto Rice was a small, dry-skinned man of about 50 who had the particular quality of being unremarkable to the point of invisibility, which Rowan had always suspected was an active cultivated skill rather than an accident of personality. He ran his telegraph with the discretion of a priest and the memory of a banker, and Rowan had used him 3 times before. Mercer, Rice said from behind the counter. Otto, I need to send a telegraph. He'd converted the letter to Aldis into a message short enough for wire, 31 words, the minimum necessary, stripped of everything that wasn't fact. Name, location, nature of operation, number of known associates. Frank Aldis was smart enough to fill in the rest. He paid for the wire, and while Rice sent it, Rowan browsed the shelves with no particular urgency and listened to the store. There were 2 other men in the store. One he recognized, a farmer named Hurley from the Eastern Range, a man of no significance either way. The other, he didn't know. The unknown man was well dressed for the frontier, his coat newer than the usual, his boots not worked in the way working boots got worked in. He was at the far counter talking to the young man who stocked shelves, and the conversation was too quiet to hear, but the body language was not. The well-dressed man was asking questions, and the stock boy was answering them with the slightly nervous energy of someone who wanted to be helpful to a person with money. Rowan watched this in his peripheral vision and said nothing. After a while, the well-dressed man left. "Who's that?" Rowan said to Rice when the door had closed. Rice glanced at where the man had been. "New in town, came through about 2 weeks ago, staying at the hotel." A pause that communicated something without saying it. "Asks a lot of questions." "About what?" "The territory, properties, who owns what, and how long they've been here." Another pause. "Was asking about your way out by name last week, actually. Who Rowan Mercer was. How long he'd been out there." Rowan let this settle. "And what did people tell him?" "Enough that he knows you're out there," Rice said, with the economy of a man who dealt in precise amounts of information. "Whether it matters, I couldn't say." It mattered. Rowan knew it mattered before he'd finished hearing it. A man well-dressed and asking specific questions about specific properties, showing up 2 weeks ago, around the time he calculated that Mara would have escaped from Bitterwater and Harlow would have started looking for her. Not a coincidence that stretched credulity. A deliberate placement. A man inside the town structure, gathering information and feeding it back. He bought flour and salt he didn't urgently need and left the store and went to the saloon. The saloon part of the hotel was quiet in the mid-morning. A barman wiping glasses, 2 men at a table with a card game that had been going long enough that neither of them was enjoying it. Del Pruitt at the far end of the bar with something in a cup that was probably not coffee. Rowan sat down one stool away from Pruitt. "Del," he said. Pruitt looked at him with the eyes of a man who was not drunk exactly, but had arranged himself comfortably in the vicinity of drunk. "Mercer, long ride for a weekday. Had business." He ordered coffee from the barman and let the silence run for a moment. "You heard of a man named Crail Harlow?" Pruitt's expression didn't change in any obvious way, but something behind his eyes shifted. A kind of very small and very quick adjustment, the way a man adjusted when he heard a name he recognized and hadn't expected to hear in this context. "Can't say I have," Pruitt said. He said it too smoothly. Not like a man who genuinely didn't know the name. Like a man who'd decided to say he didn't know the name. "Man running some kind of operation south of here," Rowan said. "Bitter water crossing. Sounds like he's been in the territory a while." "Lots of people in the territory." "This one's moving people against their will," Rowan said, plain and flat, watching Pruitt's face. "Women, mostly. Has riders who come onto private property asking questions." Pruitt drank his not coffee. His eyes stayed on the bar surface. "That's a serious accusation. I'm not accusing anyone. I'm telling you what I know. Thought the law might want to be aware." A long pause. Pruitt turned his cup around in his hands. "That kind of thing," Pruitt said finally, "if it's even true, is more of a federal matter, outside my jurisdiction." "I know that," Rowan said. "I've already contacted a federal marshal." Now Pruitt looked at him. Directly, for the first time. "You did?" "This morning." Something moved in Pruitt's face. Not quite fear, not quite anger. Closer to the look of a man who just understood that the ground he was standing on was less stable than he'd thought. "Well," Pruitt said, that's probably the right call. If there's something to it." Rowan drank his coffee. "The man at the general store," he said. "New in town. Staying at the hotel. You know him?" Pruitt's jaw tightened very slightly. "Few new faces lately. This one's been asking about land ownership out this way, including my property specifically." He set the coffee cup down. "I'd be interested to know his name." "Can't help you there," Pruitt said. "Don't make it my business to know everyone's name." He was lying, and they both knew it, and neither of them said so. Rowan put money on the bar for the coffee and stood up. "One more thing," he said. "If anyone comes asking about my property, or about any woman connected to my property, anyone at all, I'd appreciate knowing about it. As the law, I mean. That's the kind of thing a neighbor would expect to be told." Pruitt looked at him with something that was hard to read. "I'll keep that in mind." Rowan left the saloon. Outside, the main street of Caldwell Flats looked the way it always looked. Quiet, functional, slightly weathered, the frontier version of normal. He stood on the boardwalk for a moment and looked at it and thought about how much of what looked like normal was not. Pruitt knew Harlow. Not suspected. Knew. The name recognition had been too fast and too controlled to be anything else. The question was whether Pruitt was simply bought, which was one kind of problem, or whether he was actively feeding information back, which was a much more serious kind of problem. Rowan thought about the well-dressed man in the store and Pruitt's non-answer about him, and revised his estimate in the worst direction. He rode out of town with a careful awareness of who might be watching him go. He got back to the cabin in the late afternoon and found it undisturbed. He checked the property carefully before going inside, not because he expected anyone to have broken in, but because the habit of checking was one he'd cultivated over years, and he wasn't going to abandon it now. Inside, everything was as he'd left it. He built up the fire and sat with it for a while, thinking. The picture was cleaner than it had been, and cleaner meant more troubling. Harlow had at least one person inside Caldwell Flats, possibly two, the well-dressed stranger and Pruitt himself. That meant information flowed both ways. Harlow could know what was happening in town, including that a federal marshal had been contacted, if Pruitt moved fast enough to tell him. He'd assumed sending the telegraph would take time to have consequences. He needed to revise that assumption. He also needed to get back to Bess Caulfield's property and tell Mara what he'd learned, because she had a right to know how the situation had shifted, and because her knowledge of Harlow's operations was the clearest map they had of what they were dealing with. He rode out to the Caulfield place the next morning, arriving before full light. Bess opened the door before he'd knocked, which told him she'd heard Cutter on the track. "She's up," Bess said. "In the kitchen." He went through. Mara was at the table with a cup of coffee, her color considerably better than the last time he'd seen her. The bruising on her face faded into that late-stage yellowish color that meant healing. She was wearing a dress that wasn't hers, slightly too short, slightly too narrow across the shoulders, but clean and intact, which meant Bess had found something for her near her. Her posture when he came in was the posture of someone who had been waiting and had disciplined themselves not to show how much. "You went to town," she said. Not a question. "Yesterday." He sat down. "Tell me about the man Harlow uses for local information. When you were there, did you ever hear him mention someone in a town, a contact?" She considered. "He mentioned a man once. Called him the Watcher. I don't know if that was a name or a description. He said the Watcher in Flats would let him know if anything interesting came through." A pause. "I assumed Flats meant Caldwell Flats." "The Watcher," Rowan said. "That's all I heard." He told her about the well-dressed man in the store, about Pruitt's reaction to the name Harlow, the way it had moved through his face like weather, about sending the telegraph to Frank Aldis. She listened without interrupting. "Pruitt's going to tell him," she said when he'd finished, "if he hasn't already, that you contacted a marshal." "I know. That changes how much time we have." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. Bess, behind him at the stove, was making noise that he recognized as the deliberate noise of someone who wanted to be understood as not listening. "Harlow will move," Mara said. "When he finds out a marshal's been contacted, he'll clear out of Bitter Water. He's done it before. He has somewhere else to go, I don't know where, but he moves fast when he needs to. He'll take—" She stopped, started again. "He'll take whoever he has there with him, however many people." He looked at her. "How many people does he have there right now, that you know of?" Her jaw tightened. "When I left, there were 3 women and 2 men who weren't his riders. People he was holding. I don't know if they're still there. People move through quickly sometimes." 3 women and 2 men. 5 people. "If Harlow runs before Frank Aldis gets here," Rowan said, "those people go with him." "Yes. How long does Frank take to get here from Cheyenne if he moves on the telegraph today?" "Fast rider, good weather? 3 days, maybe 4. He looked at the window. "That's assuming he moves immediately. If he needs authorization, if he needs to put a group together—" "He won't have time," Mara said. She said it flat and certain, the voice she used when she was stating something she wished were different. "Harlow will move in 2 days, maybe less, if Pruitt is fast. He's done this before. He has a system for disappearing." The kitchen was very quiet for a moment except for the stove. "Then we can't wait for Frank," Rowan said. Mara looked at him across the table. "No," she said, "we can't. Behind them, Bess set a cup of coffee on the table for Rowan, without comment, and went back to the stove. And the stove made its ordinary sounds. And outside the Caulfield property, the morning was gray and cold, and the sheep were making the sounds sheep made when they wanted to be led into pasture. And it was all very normal, except for the specific and urgent wait of what had just been decided. They weren't going to wait. That meant they were going to act with what they had. A rancher who knew the territory, a woman who knew the layout of the place they were heading toward, and the particular advantage that comes from moving before the people you're moving against expect you to. "Tell me everything you remember about Bitterwater," Rowan said. "The layout, the barn, which room Harlow sleeps in, where he keeps his men at night, all of it. Don't skip anything because you think it's small." Mara wrapped both hands around her coffee cup, and she told him everything. They spent the rest of that morning at Bess Caulfield's table, going over what Mara knew until Rowan had a map in his head that he could walk through with his eyes closed. The main building at Bitterwater sat on a slight rise above the creek, facing north, with the barn about 40 feet to the east and a smaller outbuilding, a wood store that Harlow's men had converted to a second sleeping room, another 20 feet beyond that. The main building had 2 windows on the north face and 1 on the west side. The east wall was blank. The door was solid timber hinged to open inward, with a bar latch on the inside that Mara described as heavy enough to hold against a reasonable amount of force, but not against a determined effort at the hinges. The people Harlow was holding were kept in the 2 back rooms of the main building at night. During the day, they were allowed limited movement in the interior. Harlow's particular method, Mara had explained, was to keep people compliant through exhaustion and controlled conditions, rather than through constant, visible force. Less noise that way. Less evidence of struggle, if anyone happened by. Harlow himself slept in the first back room. His 4 riders rotated watch, with 2 sleeping in the outbuilding and 2 in the barn, and 1 man on rotation through the night who walked the perimeter every 2 hours. The watch schedule was loose. Mara had said it tightened up when Harlow was anxious about something and went slack when he felt secure. Given the recent search along the Caldwell Road, she thought he'd be somewhere between the 2 extremes. "The creek approach from the south," Rowan said. "You said it provides cover. The willows along the bank are thick enough to move through without being seen from the building, but the bank itself is soft. The ground between the creek and the rise is boggy in places. If you're moving in the dark, you'll hear it under your feet before you feel it." "Which side of the rise is least visible from the north windows?" "West. The angle cuts off your sight line about halfway up." She traced a line on the table with her finger, not drawing, but indicating. "If you come up the west side of the rise, you're not visible until you're almost at the west window, and that window doesn't have a shutter that opens easily. It sticks. They don't use it for looking out." "The barn," he said. "How many horses?" "When I was there, 6. That was Harlow, and 4 riders, and 1 extra. If it's the same now, that's still 5 men." She looked at him. "Rowan, 5 men and 1 of you. I know the count. And the people inside. If it goes loud, if there's shooting, they're in those back rooms with no way out. I know that too." She looked at him steadily. "Then tell me the plan." He told her. She listened the whole way through without interrupting, which he'd noticed was a habit she had when she was doing serious assessment. She took the whole thing in first before she started pulling at the threads. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, turning it over. "The timing depends on the watch rotation," she said. "If the man walking the perimeter changes his schedule, then the timing adapts. You're alone." "Up until the point where I'm not," he said, and looked at her. She looked back at him. "I told you I'm not running." "This isn't running. This is the part where you're the reason the whole thing works." He held her gaze. "I can get into that building. I can't get 5 people out quietly while managing whatever Harlow decides to do about it. That part needs someone the people inside will trust enough to follow without making noise. They don't know me. They know you're not one of Harlow's men. Right now, that's enough." She was quiet for a moment. "And if it goes wrong before I get there," she said, "if there's shooting before you signal, then you don't come in. You take whoever gets out and you ride for Caldwell Flats, and you find Otto Rice, and you tell him to telegraph Frank Aldous that the situation at Bitterwater is active." He kept his voice even. "You don't come in for me." She looked at him with an expression that he couldn't entirely read, some mix of things he didn't want to examine too closely right now. That's the worst part of this plan, she said. I know. Another silence. Bess, who had been doing things at the far end of the kitchen with decisive quietness for the past half hour, set a plate of bread and dried meat on the table between them and left the room without comment, which was the most useful thing anyone had done all morning. Mara pulled a piece of bread toward her and didn't eat it immediately. When? She said. Tonight, before Pruitt has time to send word south. He reached for the meat. We leave here at dark. Ride to within a mile of Bitter Water on the north track, leave the horses in the scrub, come in on foot from the west. I go in first. You wait at the tree line south of the rise until you hear 2 knocks on the west wall. That means the back rooms are open, and the people inside are ready to move. You come up the west side, in the window, if it'll take you, through the door if it won't. Get them out to the horses and move north. 2 knocks, she said. 2 knocks. If you hear anything else, anything that sounds like a fight, like a gun. I know, she said. Rice in the telegraph. Yes. She looked at the bread in her hands. And you actually believe this works? I believe it has a reasonable chance of working, he said. That's different from believing it works. She almost smiled at that. Almost. The corner of her mouth moved in a way that acknowledged the honesty without quite committing to finding it reassuring. All right, she said. The 4th time she'd said those words to him in this particular way, and each time they meant something slightly heavier than the time before. Bess took the plan with the same equanimity she seemed to take everything, which Rowan had come to understand was not indifference but a form of trust in her own judgment. She'd decided he was a reasonable man and that Mara was worth protecting, and given those 2 facts, she wasn't going to waste energy on concern that didn't change the outcome. What she did was practical. She found Mara a pair of her youngest son's old work trousers and a dark shirt, which were close enough in fit to be functional, and she wrapped a length of dark wool around Mara's shoulders in a way that could function as a shawl or as a head covering depending on the need. She gave Rowan a bag of cold food for the ride and said nothing about the nature of what they were riding toward. At the door, she held Mara's arm for a moment. You come back through here when it's done, she said. Either way. Mara looked at her. Either way, she said. Bess let her go. They rode south in the last of the daylight, into the particular stillness that settled over the grassland at dusk. The wind dying, the temperature dropping, the sky going through its sequence of colors, and then past them into dark. Rowan rode Cutter. Mara rode Plenty, who had accepted her without complaint over the past several days, which Rowan took as a reasonable endorsement. They didn't talk much on the ride. There was a quality to the silence between them now that was different from the careful silence of the early days in the cabin. Less guarded, more functional. The silence of 2 people who had said what needed saying and were now in the part that came after words. Once, in the middle stretch where the road ran between 2 low ridges and the dark was nearly complete, Mara said, I should tell you something. He waited. When I was at Bitter Water the first time, the night I arrived. She was quiet for a moment, and he could hear Plenty's hooves in the grass beside him. There was a woman already there. She'd been there for 2 months. She was from somewhere in the Southern Territories. She didn't speak much English, but she was very calm. Not frightened the way the others were. She'd made a decision, I think, about who she was and what they could and couldn't take from her, and she was holding to it. A pause. I think about her a lot. I don't know what happened to her. She might still be there, Rowan said. She might. Then we might find out tonight. Mara was quiet for a moment. Yes, she said. We might. They left the horses tied in a thick stand of scrub oak about a mile north of where the fork led down toward Bitter Water, in a hollow that was sheltered from the wind and dark enough that they weren't visible from the road. Rowan checked his rifle and his pistol, which he carried in a holster he didn't usually wear. He had rope coiled at his saddle, a knife on his belt, and a small toolkit in his coat pocket that included things that were useful for persuading latches. Mara checked nothing because she had nothing to check except herself, which she did in her own way. Standing still for a moment with her eyes closed, breathing deliberately, the way he'd seen her do once before in the cabin before she'd said something difficult. Coming to herself was how he'd thought of it. Stay west of the track going down, she said when she opened her eyes. There's a section of dry creek bed about a quarter mile above the fork, runs parallel to the track for 100 feet. You can move fast in it without making much sound. You know the approach on foot. I practiced it, she said. In my head. During the months I was there. I used to look at the terrain and think about how I'd get out if I could. She looked at him. I just didn't know I'd be coming back in. They moved off the road and went south through the grass, Mara slightly behind and to his left, and the dark was complete now, the sky overcast enough that there was no useful starlight. They moved by feel and by the shape of things against the dark sky, which was a skill Rowan had developed over years of working the range at night, and which Mara, he found, had developed in a different context for different reasons, but to similar practical effect. He found the dry creek bed where she'd said it was. They moved through it quickly, crouching, the gravel underfoot quiet enough. At the end of it he stopped, and she stopped beside him, and they waited without moving while he listened. The wind had come back slightly, enough to move through the grass and provide cover for small sounds. He could smell the creek, the mineral sharpness of it that had given it its name, and he could see faintly the dark mass of the buildings on the rise about 300 yards to the southeast. A light in the main building, faint through the north window. The barn was dark. He counted to a slow 60 and watched for movement. Nothing moved. He touched Mara's arm, 2 fingers on her forearm, the agreed signal for wait here, and she went still and he moved off alone toward the west side of the rise. The ground was indeed boggy near the creek, just as she'd warned him, and he picked his way through it by feel, moving his weight slowly before committing to each step. He got across it without making significant noise, which he considered a reasonable outcome. The rise itself was firm enough under the grass, and he went up the west slope in a low crouch, keeping the bulk of the building between himself and the north windows. He reached the west wall without incident. He pressed his back against the timber and listened. From inside, muffled by the wall, voices. 2 of them, in the front room, talking in the way men talked when they weren't worried about being overheard. Relaxed. He couldn't make out words through the timber, but the tone was what mattered. Easy, not alert. The west window was above him, about 4 feet off the ground. He reached up and touched the shutter, solid timber, and when he applied gentle pressure it moved about an inch and then stuck, exactly as Mara had described. The latch was a simple hook. He took out his toolkit and worked the gap with a thin piece of bent metal and had the hook free in under a minute, which he was quietly pleased about. He eased the shutter open. The window was unglazed, which was common out here, a square opening with no glass, just the shutter for weather. He looked through it into a narrow interior passage between the front room and the back rooms. Dark. The light was in the front room to his left. The passage led right toward the back rooms. He listened again. 2 men talking in his front room. He still couldn't make out the words. He could make out now that one of them was moving around. He heard footsteps on a board floor, the particular sound of someone getting up and sitting down and getting up again. Restless. He went through the window. It was not a graceful maneuver. The opening was adequate for the purpose, but not generous about it, and the drop on the inside was slightly less than the rise on the outside, so he came down harder than he wanted to and had to catch himself against the wall with one hand. He held very still afterward and waited. The voices in the front room continued without interruption. He moved down the passage toward the back rooms. The first door on his right was closed. He put his ear against it and heard breathing. More than one person, the irregular breathing of people in uneasy sleep. He tried the handle. It moved, but when he pushed, the door didn't open. Locked from the outside, a simple bolt that he could feel on his side of the door, but couldn't reach the handle from this position. He slid the bolt. The door opened inward. The smell hit him first. Close air, unwashed bodies, the staleness of a room that didn't get enough ventilation. In the faint light from the gap beneath the front room door, he could make out shapes. 4 people on the floor or against the wall, on bedrolls or bare boards. They were awake. He could feel it, the held breath, the sudden rigidity of people who'd learned to be ready to react to someone coming through their door. He crouched down and said very low, "I'm not one of his men. My name is Rowan Mercer. I'm here to get you out." Silence. Someone shifted. A woman's voice, barely a breath. "How many of you?" "There's another person outside," he said. "She was held here before. She escaped. She came back." A longer silence. Mara? A different voice, this one from further back in the room. Something in the word, recognition and disbelief braided together. He couldn't tell if they'd made a sound that carried. He needed to move faster. Stay here until I signal, he said. Don't make noise. Is there anyone in the other back room? 2 men, the first voice said. Harlow's. They sleep there some nights. He'd been operating on the assumption it was empty. He revised. Are they there now? I heard them go in an hour ago. That changed the geometry of the next several minutes considerably. He went back into the passage and to the second door and put his ear against it and heard what he'd hoped not to hear. The specific sound of at least one person in light sleep, the kind of sleep that was one loud sound away from being something else. He went back to the window. 2 knocks on the west wall, his knuckles against the exterior timber, as quiet as he could make them and still have them carry. Then he waited. He heard her before he saw her. The faint sound of movement in the grass outside, then a shape at the window, and then Mara was through it in a single movement that was considerably more efficient than his had been, landing almost silently and straightening beside him. She looked at him. He pointed toward the back room and held up 4 fingers, 4 people, then held up 2 more and pointed at the other door. She understood immediately. He could see her recalibrating, the same revision he'd done, and she nodded. She went to the back room. He heard her very low. It's Mara. We need to go right now. He went to the front room door. He couldn't lock it from this side. What he could do was what he did. He moved the single piece of furniture in the passage, a wooden bench that had no business being there, probably moved from somewhere else, and braced it under the front room door handle. It wouldn't hold long. It didn't need to. The second back room door was a problem he hadn't fully solved. If the 2 men inside woke up and came out, the whole thing came apart before the people in the first room were anywhere near the window. He needed those 2 men to stay asleep for another 3 minutes. He didn't have a clean solution. He had an imperfect one, which was that he stood outside that door in the dark passage and put his hand on the handle and held it and hoped. Mara was moving people through the passage toward the window. He heard them. She was controlling it well, keeping them moving, keeping them quiet. But 4 people in an unlit passage made sound no matter how careful you were. A whispered exchange that he caught the shape of, but not the words. Someone's feet on a loose board. The door under his hand moved. He held it. The person on the other side tried again, harder. He braced his shoulder against the door and held. What? A voice from inside, groggy. He didn't answer. He held the door and watched the window over his shoulder and saw the third person going through. And then a fourth. And Mara turned back and looked at him, and he made a gesture with his head. Go. Go now. She shook her head. He made the gesture again, more emphatic. She shook her head again with an expression that said this particular argument was already over and he should stop having it, and she moved to the other side of the passage and braced her own shoulder against the wall and waited. The door shook. Both men were at it now. He could tell from the weight. Hey, one of them said, louder. Hey! The front room door rattled against the bench. He let go of the door and grabbed Mara's wrist, and they went through the window, him first, her right behind him, and dropped into the dark grass on the west side of the rise, and he grabbed her arm and they ran. Behind them, from inside the building, a shout, then another. Then the sound of the bench going over and the front room door slamming open, and a man's voice, loud now, no longer being contained. Harlow! Harlow! There! They were halfway down the west slope, running in the dark, when the first lamp came on in the north window and threw a rectangle of yellow light across the grass ahead of them. The 4 people from the back room were somewhere ahead in the dark. He could hear them, a group of people running without knowing exactly where they were running, which was dangerous but necessary. He whistled, 2 sharp notes, the sound carrying in the quiet, and heard the running ahead of them shift direction toward the sound. He found them at the edge of the boggy ground near the creek. 4 people, 3 women, and a man, in various states of what he could only call barely held together. They were moving. That was what mattered. Mara, he said, breathing hard, take them north, stay off the track. I'll catch up. Rowan, go, he said. She looked at him for one hard second, then she turned to the 4 people and said, with me, keep up, stay quiet, and moved. He turned back toward the rise. He could hear shouting from the building now, multiple voices, the disorganized sound of men surprised out of routine. A lamp was moving in the barn. Greer's voice, he thought, or a voice with the same register as Greer's. He couldn't be certain in the dark and the distance. He counted the voices. 2 from the building, 1 from the barn. That was 3. Harlow made 4. He worked his way around to the north side of the rise, staying below the line where the lamplight reached, and found a position in the long grass where he could see the front door of the building. If Harlow was going to move on the telegraph, if Pruitt had already sent word and Harlow was planning to clear out tonight, he needed to know it. A man who ran disappeared and took his operation somewhere else, and the next woman he found on the road wasn't going to have Rowan Mercer looking the right direction when the horse shied. The front door opened. A man came out that he hadn't seen before, tall, lean, unhurried in his movements despite the noise coming from the barn behind him. He stood on the threshold of the building and looked out into the dark with the specific stillness of a man who was not panicking, who was thinking. Rowan knew without being told that this was Harlow. He watched him. Harlow looked north, then west, then north again. He went back inside and came out a moment later with a rifle. He said something to someone inside that Rowan couldn't hear. Then he walked toward the barn, calling something to the men there, his voice now carrying a sharp authority that cut through the noise and quieted it. He was organizing, getting horses, deciding something. Rowan made his own decision. He stood up from the grass and walked toward the front door of the building and went inside. It was empty. The front room showed the evidence of a hasty abandonment. An overturned cup, a card game left mid-play, one boot abandoned near the bench that was now on the floor where it had fallen. The lamp was still burning. He went to the far table and found what he was looking for, a leather satchel, the kind a man used for papers. He opened it. Inside were documents, contracts, Rowan saw immediately, contracts with dates and signatures and sums of money, and terms of arrangement that said plainly, and in the specific language of transaction, what the nature of Harlow's business was. Names of buyers, names of sellers, names of the people who had been moved, towns and dates and amounts. The whole machinery of it, in ink, in a leather bag sitting on a table because Harlow had been planning to move and had pulled these out to take with him. He took the satchel. He also took a second document that had been sitting separately from the others, unfolded on the table. A letter. And the letterhead on it was not Harlow's and was not anyone he didn't know. It was the Caldwell Flats Sheriff's Office, Del Pruitt's signature at the bottom, and the date on it was 2 days ago. He folded the letter and put it in his coat pocket and went out the front door and back into the dark. He heard horses from the barn, the sound of animals being moved quickly, gear being thrown on, the abbreviated noise of men saddling up under instruction. Harlow was leaving. He was taking his riders and going, which was the outcome Rowan had calculated as the most likely. A man who survived in this business survived by knowing when to run. He didn't try to stop them. He was one man with a rifle, and Harlow had 4 riders, and the people he'd come here for were already moving north with Mara. Stopping Harlow's escape was Frank Aldis's problem. His problem was making sure Frank Aldis had what he needed to finish it. He had the satchel. He moved north through the grass in the dark, away from the sound of horses, toward where he'd left Cutter and Plenty in the scrub oak hollow. He moved fast and didn't look back. Ba-ma-mamas. He found them at the horses. Mara had gotten all 4 people there, 3 women and a man, as she'd said, and when Rowan came into the hollow, he found them in the various conditions of people who have been under someone else's control for a long time and have just, very suddenly, stopped being. Some were shaking. One of the women was making a sound that was quiet enough that it wasn't quite crying and loud enough that it wasn't quite not. The man was sitting on a rock with his hands between his knees and staring at the ground. One of the women, a tall woman, dark-featured with the particular calm Mara had described, was standing slightly separate from the others, her arms crossed, watching the southern darkness. She looked at Mara when Mara came in, and Mara looked at her, and nothing was said for a moment, and then Mara said, "You're still here." "I said I would be," the woman said, which implied a conversation that had happened months ago in a bad place, and left it there. Rowan didn't ask about it. He counted the horses, his 2, plus nobody else's, which meant the people from the back room had come here on foot, which meant they were going to have to go back on foot or double up. He made that calculation and reached its conclusion and looked at Mara. You and the woman who can't walk take the horses, Mara said before he spoke, indicating one of the three women who had sat down in the grass and wasn't getting up on her own. The rest of us walk. It's a mile to the road and 2 hours to Caldwell Flats from there, he said. I know. She looked at him. Is Harlow gone? He ran. Something moved in her face. Not relief, more like a door closing, a thing concluded, though not in the way that was entirely satisfying. He'll run to somewhere else. I have his papers, Rowan said. She stared at him. He held up the satchel, contracts, names, amounts, dates, everything a federal marshal needs to know where he went and who helped him. He reached into his coat and produced the folded letter. And a letter from Del Pruitt to Crail Harlow, dated 2 days ago, that explains why Harlow knew to run before Frank Aldous arrived. Mara looked at the letter, then at him, then at the letter again. Pruitt, she said. Not a question. Pruitt. She was quiet for a moment. Around them, the hollow was still and cold, and the people they'd brought out of that building were trying to locate themselves in the new reality of being outside it. And the horses were patient in the way horses were patient when they could tell that standing still was the correct behavior. That's enough, she said finally. For Frank Aldous. That's enough for a lot of people, he said, including whoever Harlow was selling to. Their names are in here. She looked at the satchel with an expression he didn't try to name. Too many things in it at once, too much compressed weight. Let's get these people to town, he said. She nodded. They moved. The walk north was long and cold, and not clean in any of the ways the word clean applied. People who had been held in a poorly ventilated room for weeks did not walk 2 miles in the dark without difficulty, and the man from the back room turned out to have an injury to his right leg. Not fresh, a poorly healed older thing, that slowed him significantly. And Mara gave him her shoulder for part of it without making a production of it, which cost her something given the stitches that were still in her side, but she didn't mention that either. The woman from the Southern Territories, the one Mara had described, the calm one, walked without complaint and helped where she could, and said almost nothing. What she said once, in accented but clear English, "There are others, not here. He moved them somewhere else 2 weeks ago." "I know," Rowan said. "The papers will tell us where." She looked at the satchel in his hand and said nothing more. They reached the horses on the road as the first gray suggestion of morning began in the east, the sky going from black to the particular dark blue that meant dawn was coming if not yet arrived. Rowan helped the woman who couldn't walk onto Cutter and swung up behind her, and they moved north on the road, and the others walked alongside, and nobody talked much. He rode with the satchel across his lap and Pruitt's letter in his coat pocket, and he thought about Harlow heading south or west in the dark with his riders and the knowledge that his papers were gone, and he thought about Frank Aldous in Cheyenne getting a telegraph that morning and what that man would do with it, and he thought about Del Pruitt waking up in Caldwell Flats in a few hours with no idea what was coming toward him. Beside him in the gray morning, Mara Vale walked with her shoulder under a stranger's arm and her face forward and her jaw set, moving north. She had come back to a place she'd escaped from. She had gone through a window in the dark and put herself between a locked door and whatever was behind it. She had walked 2 miles in the dark with torn stitches she hadn't mentioned until the ground started showing color, and he noticed her pressing her left side with one hand. "The stitches," he said. "They're holding," she said, which he suspected was approximately true and not entirely the whole story. "Bess will look at them when we get back." "I know," she said. The road ahead ran straight and gray in the early light, and Caldwell Flats was still an hour's distance, and the satchel in his lap held the shape of what happened next. The map of a man's operation laid out in ink for someone with the authority to act on it. It was enough. He thought it was enough. He looked at Mara walking beside him in the cold morning with her face turned north, and he didn't say anything because there wasn't anything left to say right now. And she walked, and the day came up around them in its ordinary way, unhurried, indifferent to what the night had been, and that was how mornings were. They arrived in Caldwell Flats as the town was just beginning to wake up. The eastern sky had gone from gray to a pale copper color that meant sunrise was maybe 20 minutes away, and the main street was empty except for a dog moving along the far side and a man at the livery who stopped what he was doing and stared at the group coming up the road. Rowan on Cutter, with a woman doubled behind him, Mara and 3 others on foot, all of them wearing the particular expression of people who had been somewhere difficult and had come out the other side of it still moving. Rowan went straight to Otto Rice's place. Rice lived above his store. There was a side door with a staircase, and Rowan knocked on it with the authority of a man who knew what he was asking for was reasonable, even if the hour wasn't. It took a minute. Then the door opened and Rice stood there in his nightshirt with a lamp, looking at the group assembled at his door with an expression of complete composure, as if this was entirely within the range of things he had prepared for. "I need to send another wire to Frank Aldous," Rowan said. "Right now." Rice looked at the people behind him. His eyes moved across them with that cataloging intelligence, taking in the worn clothing, the state of them, the fact that there was a woman pressing her side with one hand and trying not to show it. "Come in," he said. He took them through the store and into the back room where the telegraph equipment was, and he lit 2 more lamps, and Rowan wrote out the message while Mara got the others settled onto the crates and barrels that lined the walls. People sitting down for the first time in hours, in a room that was not the room they'd been kept in, and the difference between those two things was working its way through them visibly. The message to Aldous was longer than the first one. Rowan included Harlow's flight direction, south and west, based on what he'd heard of the horses and the shouting, and the fact that he had Harlow's papers in his possession, and Del Pruitt's name and the nature of Pruitt's involvement, and the names of 2 other towns mentioned in the contracts he'd read by lamplight on the ride north, towns where Harlow had buyers, towns that Aldous would need to notify. Rice sent the wire without comment or question. Then Rowan said, "Is Pruitt awake yet?" "He won't be for another hour," Rice said. "He doesn't open the office until 7. I need someone to stay with these people until I get back. Someone you trust." Rice considered this for approximately 2 seconds. "My wife," he said. "She's upstairs." His wife turned out to be a round-faced woman named Clara, who appeared in the back room 10 minutes later with 2 loaves of bread and a pot of coffee, and a demeanor that communicated clearly that she had been married to Otto Rice long enough that unusual situations showing up before dawn were simply part of the texture of her life, and she had made her peace with it. Rowan looked at Mara. "Stay here," he said. "I know," she said, which surprised him. He'd expected an argument. She looked at the people from Bitterwater, the 3 women and the man with the leg, all of them in various states of sitting or leaning, Clara moving among them with bread and coffee. "Someone needs to be here with them." "Clara—" "Someone who knows what happened," Mara said. Not sharply, just precisely. He looked at her for a moment. She was right, and he knew she was right, and the stitches in her side had held through the night, but barely, and she needed to sit down, and being needed was probably the thing that would actually make her sit down. "I'll be back," he said. "I know that too," she said. He left. Del Pruitt did not answer his door for the first 2 minutes of knocking. On the 3rd minute, he appeared in the doorway of his residence, a small house attached to the back of the sheriff's office, in a state of dishevelment that confirmed Rice's estimate of his schedule. He looked at Rowan, and then at the hour, and then at Rowan again. And something in his face went careful in the specific way faces went careful when the person wearing them was trying to figure out how much trouble had arrived and from which direction. "Mercer," he said, "it's not 7. "I know what time it is," Rowan said. "I need to talk to you. Come back at now, Del." Pruitt looked at him for another moment, then stepped back and let him in. The residence was what it was, a bachelor's room with the curtains still drawn and a bottle on the table that was closer to empty than full, and a coat thrown over a chair that had been thrown there some days ago and not moved since. Pruitt sat down heavily and rubbed his face with both hands. Rowan put Pruitt's letter on the table in front of him. The man's hand stopped moving. He looked at the letter, looked at Rowan, looked at the letter again. "Where did you—" "Harlow's table at Bitterwater," Rowan said. "I was there last night. Harlow's gone. He ran south, took his riders with him." He sat down across from Pruitt without being invited to. "But he left his papers, including that." Pruitt looked at the letter with the expression of a man watching a wall fall toward him and calculating that he does not have time to move. "That letter," Rowan said, "tells Harlow that a federal marshal has been contacted about operations at Bitterwater and that he should move immediately. It's dated 2 days ago, Del, the same day I sent the telegraph from Rice's office." He kept his voice even. "Which means you knew about Harlow before I walked into that saloon and said his name. You knew and you told him, and 5 people spent 2 more days in that back room because of it." Pruitt's jaw worked without producing words. "I've sent a second wire to Frank Aldis this morning," Rowan said. "He has your name now. He has the letter. He has everything in Harlow's satchel, which includes at least 2 references to payments made to a local law enforcement contact in Caldwell Flats." He watched Pruitt's face process this. "So here's what's going to happen. You're going to sit in this room and you're not going to send word to anyone, and when Frank Aldis arrives, which will be in 3 days, maybe 4, you're going to tell him everything. Who approached you, when, how much, what you told them." Mercer, "All of it, Dell." He leaned forward slightly. "Because the alternative is that Frank arrives and finds you've run, and then you're not a corrupt small-town sheriff who made a bad decision and can cooperate his way to a better outcome. You're a fugitive. And Frank Aldis is a patient man with a long memory and a federal commission, and the territory isn't that big." Pruitt sat in his chair with the letter in front of him and looked like a man who had been slowly constructing something for years that had just, in the space of a few minutes, been demonstrated to have no foundation. "How much did he pay you?" Rowan said. A long silence. "Not enough," Pruitt said finally. He said it without self-pity, just flatly, like a fact he'd been sitting with for a while and had given up trying to make feel better. Rowan stood up. "Stay here," he said. "All of it, Frank Aldis. Don't make it worse than it already is." He left Pruitt sitting at his table with the letter and the bottle and the curtains still drawn against the morning. Frank Aldis arrived on the morning of the 4th day. He arrived the way federal marshals arrived when they were taking something seriously, with 2 deputies, 4 horses, and the kind of deliberate, unhurried speed that communicated authority without aggression. He was a tall man, narrow-built, with a face that had been weathered into something spare and attentive, and he'd been riding since the morning after Rowan's first telegraph and looked like it. Rowan met him at the edge of town. "You look terrible," Frank Aldis said, which was his version of a greeting. "You look like you haven't slept in 4 days, Rowan said, which was true. 3.5. Frank swung down from his horse, and they shook hands in the way of men who trusted each other without ceremony. "The papers." Rowan gave him the satchel. Frank opened it and looked at the top documents without removing them, the same way a man checked a card hand, just enough to know what he was holding, and then closed it. "Pruitt. In his office. He hasn't run. He hasn't sent word to anyone, as far as I can tell." "You've been watching." "Rice has. Rice notices everything." Frank nodded once. He handed the satchel to one of his deputies and looked at Rowan with the direct attention of a man who had processed the telegraphs and the implications and had questions that went beyond the operational. "The woman," he said, "the one who escaped. She's here?" "She's here. I need to talk to her." "I know, she knows." He paused. "She'll tell you everything she saw and heard. She's been waiting to tell someone with the authority to act on it for 8 months. Frank looked at him for a moment with an expression that was harder to read than his operational face, something personal in it, some reaction to what he was hearing that he was keeping professional, but not entirely successfully. 8 months, he said. "Yes." Frank Aldis was quiet for a moment. Then, "Where is she?" Mara Vale told her story to Frank Aldis in the back room of Otto Rice's store, sitting at the table where the telegraph equipment was, with Clara Rice's coffee in front of her and 2 of Frank's deputies taking notes in the careful way of men whose notes were going to be read by judges. She told it straight through from the beginning, without embellishment and without softening. The man who had recruited her, the journey, the 8 months at Bitterwater and the other locations she'd been moved through, the names she'd heard, the transactions she'd witnessed, the people who had come and gone through Harlow's operation. She told it with the flat precision of someone who had rehearsed it in their head many times. Not rehearsed for performance, but rehearsed to make sure nothing was lost, the way you rehearsed a thing you were afraid of forgetting. Frank Aldis listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "You wrote none of this down while you were there." "I couldn't write anything down," she said. "If they'd found it. So this is from memory." "Yes. 8 months of memory." She looked at him steadily. "I have a very clear memory," she said. "When something matters, I don't forget it." Frank looked at her for a moment with that same complicated expression he'd worn when Rowan had said 8 months. Then he said, "I believe you. Everything you've told me matches what's in those contracts. Something shifted in Mara's face. Not surprise exactly, but a kind of acknowledgement. The expression of someone who has braced for being doubted and found themselves unexpectedly not doubted. Harlow ran south, she said. He has contacts in 2 territories south of here. The names are in the satchel. He'll try to restart somewhere they don't know him. He won't get that far, Frank said, with a certainty that came from experience rather than optimism. I've got 2 other marshals riding the southern routes as of yesterday morning. The names in those contracts are going to 7 different jurisdictions today. He looked at the notes his deputies had taken. The buyers, the men who paid Harlow for access, those cases are going to take longer. Some of them have lawyers and standing, and they're going to fight it. But they'll be named, publicly. That's something. It was something. Mara seemed to understand that it was imperfect, that justice in this particular shape was slow and uneven, and some of the men whose names were in that satchel would find ways to minimize what happened to them. The frontier was full of men who had money and connections and used both to manage consequences. But they would be named. Their names would be in federal documents. The shape of what they'd done would exist on record somewhere that couldn't be unfiled. And Del Pruitt, she said. Pruitt's a different situation, Frank said. He cooperated. That counts for something in terms of what happens to him, though not as much as he probably hopes. He closed the notebook. He's going to lose the commission, at minimum. Mara nodded. She looked down at her coffee cup, which was empty. What about the others? She said. The ones who were at Bitter Water. There's a woman. She said Harlow moved some people 2 weeks ago, somewhere south. We're looking, Frank said. It's in the wire I sent this morning. Every marshal who has Harlow's known contacts has been told there are people to find. He paused. It's not a guarantee. I want to be honest with you about that. Some of them, I know, she said. She said it quietly, not cutting him off, but arriving at the end of his sentence before he did. Because she'd had 8 months to understand the shape of what happened to people who fell into operations like Harlow's, the odds that applied, the ones who were found and the ones who weren't. The room was quiet for a moment. Frank Aldous stood up and extended his hand across the table, which Mara looked at briefly before taking it. He shook it with the same firmness he'd used with Rowan. What you did, he said, taking apart what you knew and bringing it out in a form that could be used, that's not nothing, Miss Vale. That's what breaks these things open. She held his gaze for a moment. It took someone finding me, she said. I'd like that to be noted. I didn't do it alone. Noted, Frank said. Del Pruitt left Caldwell Flats 3 weeks later, after 2 formal interviews with federal investigators and the quiet surrender of his commission and his badge. He left on a Tuesday morning, which was unremarkable, and the town watched him go with the particular silence of a community that was absorbing something uncomfortable about itself, that the man they'd trusted with the shape of the law had been selling pieces of it, and that they hadn't seen it, and that not seeing things was its own kind of participation in them. Crail Harlow was found 6 weeks after that, in a small settlement 3 territories south, in the process of establishing himself under a different name. Frank Aldous made the arrest personally, which was not standard procedure, but which he'd apparently decided was appropriate. The trial, when it came, involved testimonies from 11 people, a satchel full of contracts, a letter from a former sheriff's office, and the sworn deposition of a woman named Mara Vale, who had been held in his operation for 8 months and had remembered every day of it. Harlow was convicted on multiple federal charges. The sentence was long enough that the frontier he'd operated in would not recognize itself by the time he was eligible to be returned to it. Several of the buyers named in his contracts faced their own legal proceedings, with varying outcomes. Some lost standing, some lost money, some lost more than that, and some, as Frank had predicted, found enough insulation in their wealth and connections to weather most of it. The names stayed in the record regardless. That was the thing that couldn't be taken back. Dex, the rider who had beaten Mara and left her in the grass and laughed about it, was taken by one of Frank's deputies riding the southern routes. He had very little to say when taken, which was its own kind of answer. Greer was found a month later in a different direction, which Frank said in his letter to Rowan was not surprising, because men like Greer usually ran sideways when their employer ran south. Marvale stayed at the Mercer cabin through the winter. It was not a decision that was made all at once, with deliberate conversation and formal arrangement. It happened the way things happened on the frontier, which was by accumulation. One practical day following another until the accumulated days had become a habit of living, and the habit of living had become something that neither of them wanted to be the one to end. She helped him find the 7 cattle he'd been short when he found her on the road. 4 of them had gone into a coulee 3 miles east and were standing at the bottom of it, looking mildly inconvenienced when Mara spotted them from the ridge, which she'd ridden up to for reasons she described as wanting air, but which Rowan suspected involved looking at the land in a way she couldn't do from ground level. She had a good eye for terrain, the kind of eye that came from paying close attention to landscape as a matter of survival. 2 more cattle turned up on their own, which happened sometimes, and the 7th was a genuine loss that he wrote off in the ledger without sentiment, because sentiment didn't change arithmetic. Bess Caulfield came by twice during those months, each time with something practical: a pot of preserved vegetables on the first visit, a length of wool cloth on the second. And she sat in the front room and drank coffee and talked to Mara in the way of 2 women who had established something between them that didn't require explanation. Rowan worked on things outside during these visits, which seemed to be what was expected of him. The woman from Bitter Water, the one from the Southern Territories, the calm one, wrote to Mara in January. The letter was brief and in a mix of English and her own language, and Mara read it without sharing all of it, but she said afterward that the woman had found a situation with a family in a town 2 territories east, people who had work and who asked few questions, which was apparently what she'd wanted. "Good," Rowan said. "Yes," Mara said. He didn't ask about the other 3 from the back room. He trusted that if she had news, she would share it, and she'd shared what she'd shared, and the rest was their own private business. The stitches in Mara's side had to be redone by Bess Caulfield on the morning after Bitterwater, because 2 of them had pulled loose during the night at the way station, which Mara had known and said nothing about, as he'd suspected. Bess had redone them with the brisk competence of a woman who'd stitched together enough living things to do it without drama, and Mara had held still for it in the same way she'd held still for Rowan's original attempt weeks earlier. Eyes forward, no sound. Afterward, Bess had said to Rowan, "She needs 2 weeks of not doing things." "She won't take 2 weeks," he said. "I know that," Bess said. "She needs it anyway." She took 10 days, which was, Rowan thought, a reasonable compromise between what the body needed and what the person living in the body was willing to give it. During those 10 days, she read his ledger books, which she found on the shelf and opened without asking, and made notes in the margins in handwriting that was considerably neater than his. And when he found the notes, he looked at them for a long time before saying anything. "You've been running this at a loss for 2 years, she said, from the chair by the window, not looking up from the book she'd moved on to, which was a different ledger, an older one. "I know that. The way you've got the grazing rotation set up, you're overworking the south pasture and underusing the east ridge. The east ridge has access problems, not insurmountable ones." She turned a page. "The fence you'd need to run is maybe 200 feet. The timber's already on the property." He looked at her. "Have you worked cattle before?" "I've worked a lot of things," she said. Cattle were one of them. He sat down and they talked about the East Ridge for about an hour. And by the end of it, he'd agreed to the fence, and she'd identified 3 other places in the operation that had inefficiencies she'd noticed from looking at his records. And at no point during this conversation did either of them acknowledge that they were, without having said so explicitly, talking about a future that involved her being here for the duration of it. That was how it happened. Not with a declaration, because declarations were for people who had surplus energy to spend on elegance, and both of them were practical people who had been through difficult things and come out the other side still fundamentally themselves, which was its own kind of accomplishment. He told her once, in February, when a snowstorm had kept them inside for 3 days, and there was nothing useful left to do with the time, "You know you don't have to be useful to be here." She was at the table with a book she'd found in the storage room, a battered novel that had come west with him from somewhere he couldn't quite remember. She looked up. "I know," she said. "I mean that. I know you mean it." She looked at him directly, the way she did when she wanted to be sure he was hearing the specific thing she was saying. "I'm not useful because I feel I have to be. I'm useful because I like it, because doing things well is—" She paused, seeming to search for the right word, which was unusual for her. She usually found them quickly. It's the thing I have that's mine. It always has been. They couldn't take that. He understood what she meant. He thought about Harlow and his riders and the 8 months they'd had her, and how they'd looked at her and seen a body to be moved and controlled, and how completely they'd failed to see the person inside it. The person who cataloged exits and memorized layouts and built a map in her head during captivity of how she would eventually leave, and then used that map to come back and take apart the whole structure from the inside. They'd underestimated her. Not just because of her size, though that was part of it, the contempt they'd worn on their faces when they left her in the grass. They'd underestimated her because she was a woman alone, without resources, without connections, without anything visible to make them afraid. They'd been wrong about all of it. "The fence on the East Ridge," he said. "Spring, when the ground's workable. You want to lay it out?" She looked at him. "I know the property better than I did when I drew that line," she said. "I've been looking at it all winter." A pause. "Yes?" Frank Aldis came through in March, riding west on other business and stopping because he was in the territory. He sat at Rowan's table and drank Rowan's coffee and talked through the case with the clinical thoroughness of a man who needed to make sure everything was properly closed before he let it be closed. Harlow's trial was set. The buyer's cases were proceeding at the pace legal cases proceeded, which was slow and uneven and occasionally infuriating, but proceeding. 2 of the people who had been held at Bitter Water and moved south had been found. One of the women and the man with the leg injury, the latter of whom had apparently been found by one of Frank's deputies attempting to work in a mine, and had been so relieved at being found that he'd sat down in the middle of the mine entrance and refused to move until someone brought him a proper meal. The other woman from the back room had not been found yet. Frank said this without equivocation, which Rowan appreciated, the honest accounting of what was and wasn't resolved. Mara sat at the table during this conversation and said relatively little. She asked 2 specific questions, about the woman not yet found, and about the legal standing of Harlow's contracts once they were introduced as evidence, which turned out to be a more complicated question than it seemed on the surface, and one that Frank answered with some care. She listened to the answers and nodded, and didn't say anything that was performatively hopeful or performatively resigned. After Frank left, she washed the cups and stood at the window for a while, looking out at the East Ridge, which still had a foot of snow on it and would for another month. "She might be found yet," Rowan said. "She might," Mara said. "Frank's still looking." "I know he is." She turned away from the window. "It doesn't resolve cleanly. That's the part that—" She stopped, then finished the sentence differently than she'd started it. "That's just the part you carry." He knew she was right. He'd learned over years of living in difficult country that the things that resolved cleanly were the minority, and you could spend yourself trying to make the messy ones clean, or you could do what could be done and carry the rest and keep moving. It wasn't wisdom exactly. It was just what the work of living required. "I know," he said. She looked at him, then looked away again at the window. "I want to write to the woman in the Eastern Territories," she said. "The one who wrote to me in January. I want to tell her what happened with the case. She deserves to know." "Write to her," he said. "Rice will send it." "I will." She paused. "I want to write to the man with the leg as well. If Frank can tell me where he is." "Frank will tell you." She nodded. And that was the shape of it. The ongoing business of tying off the threads that could be tied and acknowledging the ones that couldn't. The work of a person who understood that surviving something didn't end at the moment the danger stopped. The East Ridge fence took them 11 days in April, working in the particular way that 2 people worked when they had both figured out each other's rhythms without making a formal study of it. She was better at the post setting, having a steadiness with the tool that he lacked, and he was faster at stringing the wire, and they divided the work accordingly without discussing it. And by the end of the 11th day, the fence ran the full 200 feet, and the East Ridge was accessible to the cattle, and Mara stood at the near end of it and looked at it with the expression of someone who had argued for a thing and seen it become real. "It's good," he said. "The 3rd post from the south end is slightly off," she said. "It'll hold, but it's not right." "We can reset it." "Next week," she said. "I need a day that isn't fence." "Fair enough." She turned away from the fence and looked across the property, at the cabin and the barn and the pastures running east and the ridgeline above. The whole ordinary working shape of the place in its spring condition, mud and new grass and the particular clarity of April light. He watched her look at it. She'd arrived on this land half dead in the dark on the back of his horse, and she'd healed on it. And she'd left it and come back to it and made it her business in ways that went beyond obligation or debt or any of the other transactional frameworks that people on the frontier use to explain arrangements that were actually more complicated than that. He didn't have a clean word for what they were to each other. He wasn't sure one existed or that it needed to. The frontier had a practical relationship with categories. You were what you did, day to day, and the doing was the definition. The south pasture, she said, still looking at the property. Next year, if we rotate the way I marked in the ledger, we should see a difference by June. That's your project, he said. She looked at him. There was something in her face, not the guarded thing that had been there in the beginning, the careful inventory taking, the constant assessment. It had been replaced over the winter by something quieter, not soft exactly, but settled, like a person who had decided where they were standing and was standing there. Yes, she said, it is. There's a thing that happens to people who have been defined by what others decided they were worth. The definition goes in deep because it comes from enough directions and enough voices that eventually you stop hearing the voices themselves and just carry the verdict as if it were your own conclusion. Mara Vale had been told, by action if not always by word, that she was too much and not enough simultaneously, too large, not pretty enough, not the kind of woman a man rescued, not the kind of woman who warranted care. The men who worked for Crail Harlow had treated this verdict as self-evident, as a fact of the world, as the thing that made it amusing to leave her in the grass to disappear. What she'd found, in the long and imperfect months that followed, was not that the verdict was wrong, though it was wrong, completely and in every particular, but that verdicts handed down by people like that had no authority. They had force while they were being enforced. Remove the force, and all you were left with was someone's poor judgment, which is not the same thing at all. She'd known this intellectually, before Rowan found her. She'd known it the way you knew things that were true, but hadn't been tested. What the months in that cabin and the night at Bitterwater and the winter after had given her was the tested version of it. The knowledge that lived in the body, not just in the mind, the kind that didn't require regular maintenance to stay true. She was not a different person than she'd been before. She'd heard people talk about transformative experiences in those terms, and she'd always found it slightly dishonest. The idea that suffering made you new, that hardship was secretly a gift. She was the same person. She'd always been the same person. What had changed was not her, but her certainty about the space she occupied, the right she had to occupy it, the permanent and non-negotiable fact of her own presence in the world. Some people needed to be told this. Some people needed to survive something terrible to arrive at it. She'd have preferred to get there another way, but she'd gotten there. The cabin had 2 rooms when Rowan built it. By the end of the first winter, with Mara in it, it had the outline of a third. The storage room cleared and modified, a wall repaired, a window opened in the east face to catch the morning light. It was not finished, because things on a working frontier property were never finished, just in different stages of being worked on. The ledger books, by the second spring, were in Mara's handwriting, which was neater and more systematic than Rowan's had been. She'd developed a method of tracking the grazing rotation that he'd initially found overly elaborate and had come to find genuinely useful, because it turned out there was real information in careful records, information that paid back the effort of keeping them. He told her this, one evening in late spring when they were going over the season's numbers by the lamp. "I know," she said, without looking up from the ledger. "I'm agreeing with you," he said. "I know that too." She made a notation. "I was right." "Yes," he said. "It's nice when you say it plainly. You were right about the East Ridge, the rotation, and the way I'd been estimating the winter feed. You were also right that the third post was off, and we should have reset it when you said." She looked up. The corner of her mouth moved. "I'll make a note," she said. "Please don't." She made the note anyway, in the margin of the ledger, in handwriting small enough that it could be mistaken for a number. He saw her do it and said nothing and looked back at his own column of figures, and the lamp was steady between them. And outside the spring evening was long, and the light was still in the western sky an hour past what winter would have allowed, and the property sat around the cabin in its working state, imperfect and in progress, which was the only state anything honest was ever in. That is the thing about hard country and hard circumstance. They do not make people into something they were not. They only reveal what was already there, the patience and the stubbornness, and the capacity to do the next thing after a bad thing, and then the next thing after that. Mara Vale had those qualities before anyone found her on the road. She'd had them through 8 months of someone trying to make her into an object, and they hadn't taken. She'd had them lying in the grass with torn ribs and blood on her dress and a fading pulse, still reaching forward with one hand. She'd reached forward. A man had happened to be looking in the right direction when his horse shied. The rest was just work. Good, necessary, difficult, ordinary work. The kind that doesn't make a story when you tell it simply, but makes a life when you live it day by day. And a life is finally the thing that matters, the only thing that was ever really at stake. The ledger closed. The lamp burned. Outside, the East Ridge fence held the line it was supposed to hold. Not perfectly, because the third post was still fractionally off, but well enough. Well enough was, most days, exactly sufficient.